Hi, I'm Renee Callahan, also known as East London Knit on the social medias, and today I'm going to show you how to work a one-color brioche rib stitch. Brioche stitch creates a thick, wonderfully textured fabric, which is totally reversible and great for cozy accessories. The stitch is simple to work, but it does take some practice. So let's get started. Here is a preview of what we're going to make. The lovely knit folks at lovecraft.com have sent me this Paintbox yarn, which is nice and chunky, so you'll be able to see everything really clearly. And I'm going to use a 5.5 millimeter needle for it. To begin, cast on 15 stitches. We're going to work one stitch either end as the selvage, a slipped stitch selvage, and the central 13 stitches in our brioche rib. You always have to work a setup row when you're beginning brioche stitch. To work our setup row, we're going to begin with our selvage stitch, which is bringing your yarn to the front. My yarn's already at the front. I'm going to slip this stitch purlwise. Okay, that's my selvage stitch. Now let's begin with the fundamental element of brioche rib, which is the yarn forward, slip one, yarn over. My yarn's already at the front, so I'm going to slip one stitch purlwise again, and then I'm going to make sure I take that yarn over the top of that slip stitch. I want the yarn to cover it. Okay, the next instruction is to knit one. As usual, a knit one. Next, we're going to just repeat those two instructions. Yarn forward between the two needles, slip one purlwise, and take the yarn over the top. That's our first instruction. Knit one, that's our second instruction. Yarn forward, slip one purlwise, take our yarn over the top, knit one. All the way across, we're going to work these two instructions until we get to the last stitch, which is our selvage stitch again. You may notice when I take my yarn forward, I slip my stitch. I don't really have to make a big gesture to cover that stitch with the yarn over. I don't want to take the yarn around again. I'd get a double yarn over. I just want to cover that stitch, and taking my yarn into knit position at the back of the work absolutely does the job, covers that stitch just like I want it to. And I knit. Yarn forward, slip one, yarn over, knit one. And my last brioche rib stitch is a yarn forward, slip one, yarn over, and this is my selvage stitch. My last selvage stitch, I'm always going to knit through the back loop. Okay. This is our setup complete for one color brioche stitch. So if we spread out the stitches across the needle here, what we want to see is a yarn over covering every other stitch. Okay? So if I roll that around so that you can see it nice and clearly, we have a yarn over covering the first stitch and then no yarn over. A yarn over and then no yarn over. Yarn over, then no yarn over. Sometimes you'll find the cross further to the back. Sometimes it'll be further to the front, sometimes right on top. It doesn't matter where it is, as long as it's crossing over. Okay, and it happens every other stitch. So once we've completed that, we only do it once. We're going to begin our next and first proper row of brioche rib. Just like we did before, we have our first stitch, that's our selvage stitch. With the yarn at front, we're going to take, slip that stitch across, and then this time, our next stitch has a yarn over crossing over the top already, right? So what we want to do whenever we come across that is work those two together. Work the yarn over and the slip stitch together, and we call it a brioche knit stitch. So in order to knit, we need to have our working yarn at the back, and I've just slipped my selvage stitch, so I'm going to take my yarn through the needles to knit position so that I can knit the slip stitch and the yarn over together in my brioche knit stitch. The next stitch does not have a yarn over. So if it helps, we can think of it as a little bit cold, that stitch, and we want to cover it. So we take our yarn forward, slip that stitch purlwise, and then cover it with a nice warm yarn over shawl. And then the next instruction is again brioche knit, which looks like a knit two together. But you're just working the yarn over and slip stitch together. And then again, we take our yarn forward, slip the next stitch purlwise, make sure it's covered by the working yarn, and brioche knit. Those are our two instructions. We're going to follow all the way to the last stitch, which is our selvage stitch. Yarn forward, slip one purlwise, make sure the yarn covers that stitch, which it will when we're in position to brioche knit the next stitch. Forward, slip one. So this last little bit looks quite messy because we slipped the first selvage stitch and we took our yarn over the following stitch. So what we want to do is make sure that we get the stitches in the right order, that yarn over belongs to the slip stitch so that we can brioche knit those together. And we have our selvage stitch there, which we knit through the back loop. Okay, and again, if we spread out that work across the needle, what we should always see is a yarn over covering every other stitch, excluding our selvage stitches. So we have our yarn over, none, yarn over, none, yarn over, none, all the way across. That's what we're looking for. And you just repeat that single row until you start to see the ridges in the brioche fabric. So let's work it one more time together. We're gonna, with the yarn at front, slip that first selvage stitch purlwise, and the next stitch that we have on the needle has no yarn over. So we can think that that stitch might be a little bit chilly. We're going to make sure it gets a yarn over shawl. My yarn is already at the front, so I'm going to slip that stitch purlwise, take my yarn over the top so that it covers that stitch, and then the next stitch does have a yarn over shawl. So I know I need to work those two together with my brioche knit stitch. So it looks like a knit two together, really. And then I continue on just as I have. That stitch has no yarn over shawl. I bring my yarn forward between the two needles. I slip that next stitch, make sure that the yarn is going to cover it when I work my brioche knit. My final brioche rib stitch has no yarn over. I know that I need to bring my yarn forward, slip it purlwise, make sure the yarn covers it, and my last selvage stitch here is worked through the back loop. Knit one through the back loop. At the beginning, it's a bit difficult to see your stitches, but once you've worked a few rows, you start to see the structure of brioche rib really coming through, and you have these solid columns of knit stitches on either side of your work, which makes it nice and fluffy. When you've worked enough and you're ready to cast your stitch or your swatch off, I would recommend making it as simple as possible for this first go, and go ahead and knit your first selvage stitch. And my next stitch has no yarn over. I'm just going to knit that as well and lift the first stitch up over the top and off the needle. And then my next stitch has a yarn over. I'm going to go ahead and brioche knit those together. And again, lift the first stitch up, over, and off as a normal bind off. So when you work that across, it'll give you the nice clean edge that you see here at the top. You want to make sure you do it nice and loose, your cast on and your cast off, so that you're not pulling in too much. If you're a tight knitter, you might want to use a larger needle. Thank you for joining me for this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed it and have learned a little something. Please do have a little practice with it so that you're all ready for next time when I show you the 2-color brioche rib stitch. Happy knitting!